Welcome to Polaris-Live, conversations on the U.S.-China relationship and its global impact as seen through the eyes of experts from around the world. The user-supported channel is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. Viewers may ask questions using the bar on the right-hand side of the screen. The recent United States presidential election is being labeled as the most important signal for the future direction of U.S. domestic and foreign policy in generations. Throughout this autumn, a select group of international experts have been invited to offer their views on the election's results, especially on what the results may or may not say about the future of U.S.-China relations. This is your host, Sarwar Kashmeri, and my guest today is the former U.S. Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel. Secretary Hagel is an American decorated military veteran who served as a United States Senator from Nebraska and as the 24th United States Secretary of Defense. Senator Hagel was the first enlisted soldier to serve as a Secretary of Defense. He co-founded Vanguard Cellular. He's the author of America, Our Next Chapter, Tough Questions, Straight Answers. Welcome back to Polaris Live, Secretary Hagel.
Cash, thank you. It's a privilege to be with you.
You know, you have served as a U.S. Secretary of Defense, Senator from the great state of Nebraska, and an entrepreneur who's done business in China. A unique background for my first question. How do you see the future of Sino-American relations today?
I think the future for our two countries, but it's a future that is about more than just the future of Sino-U.S. relations. It's a future about the world. And I think our future is developing. It's being defined. We are at a critical time, as you noted in your introduction, about what this last presidential election represents, because so much of the world is being defined, at least for the next probably 25 years, by the relationships of great powers. The two greatest powers on earth are China and the United States. Economic power, military power, and all that it represents. And so it's so critically important that we use this opportunity to set a strategic focus on where we want this relationship to go. What do we expect out of this relationship? And I think both sides feel that way. Both sides have their own interests, of course, and have their own alliances that affect all of this. But that's generally where I see this, Cash. It's wide open as to where this relationship can go. It depends on the leadership in each country. It depends on dynamics, economic dynamics, how we treat each other, how we see each other, and all that goes into a strong, not just craftsmanship of policy, of strategic foreign policy, but all that's included in foreign policy.
So, well, thank you for that answer. You've set me up, Chuck, perfectly for the next question. So, you know, Mexico has just supplanted China as the main source of goods into America. China's share dropped from 21 to 13%. Now the U.S. is getting ready to put almost 60% or additional tariffs, as I recall, from imports from China. Your thoughts on what this means for the U.S. and for China?
Well, tariffs, in my opinion, Cash, have always been dangerous. I have never been a great proponent of throwing tariffs on countries to penalize them for whatever it is. I think tariffs can be useful at the right time, but you've got to understand that with tariffs come a multitude of consequences. Consequences economic for our country, the country that puts the tariffs on. Eventually, our consumers pay higher prices for those goods coming in. You've got supply chain issues. In the case of what the Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration, announced yesterday, that it was going to put 25% tariffs on Canadian and Mexican products.
Yes.
And increase our tariffs on China. There will be major consequences to that. Also diplomatic. When you start tariffing your closest partners, strategic, foreign policy, national security partners, there will be consequences to that, how the rest of the world sees you. And you can't tariff your way out of trouble. If you've got economic issues, you need to deal with those economic issues as to what the problems are. And again, tariffs can be useful in certain circumstances, but I hope that this administration doesn't do what President Trump has said he will do, and that is just put tariffs on everybody across the board, because that will result in very negative, significant consequences for this country, and it'll be shown in foreign policy, in national security, in relationships that we have with allies that we depend on, especially for projection of power around the world. But you'll see it in every dimension.
Well, I also was thinking, Mr. Secretary, about the impact on ASEAN countries like Vietnam and Indonesia and Malaysia, because something like this just doesn't stop at one's borders, does it? It keeps flowing into the so-called global South now, that is becoming very much richer and more powerful and has more influence. And as you say, these are the allies we need in Asia, don't we?
Well, that's a good point to bring up, Cash, to make my point. The ASEAN countries, I mean, those Indo-Pacific countries are critical for our interests. Freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, East China Sea. I mean, the Chinese are and have been crowding everybody on those issues. Matter of fact, in 2014, when I met with Xi in China, that was the main topic of the meetings that I had with Xi. And so what you brought up is just one example of what I refer to as consequences to tariffs, because what you will force those countries, the ASEAN countries, to do, you'll force them to choose between the United States and China in many respects. Well, if you're sitting there in the South China Sea area, an ASEAN country in the Indo-Pacific, you're right next to China. You're thousands and thousands of miles away from the United States. And it's pretty clear to me, if we force them into these you choose situations, they're not going to choose us for military reasons, security reasons, for trade reasons, history, diplomacy, a lot of reasons. And then we isolate our two strongest and best partners since World War II, South Korea and Japan.
Yes.
And put them in a very difficult spot. And Australia. So we've got to think through all these things before we start slamming tariffs on our partners.
You know, China has invested billions of dollars recently in building a historic, they're calling it mega port, the analysts are, in Peru.
Yes.
It will generate some 4 billion in additional revenue for the country, create 8,000 jobs. The U.S. has demonized the port, but instead of helping Peru do something like that, we are offering them 40 trains that belong in the 1980s, right? I mean, this kind of aid used to be a real strength of America. Little blue sky here, Chuck, but what's happened? Why are we falling so far behind in helping our neighbors?
Well, there are a lot of reasons for that, Cash, but I think one is that we've not focused the way we should have been focusing the last few years on relationships, strengthening our allies and our partners, helping them in many ways. We do more for more countries than any country in the history of man, but we've got to be smarter in how we do it. And what that means is you've got to prioritize what you're doing, and it's got to, what we're talking about here, Cash, it has to be a top priority in your foreign policy, your economic policy, and it all is integrated into one policy for your country, for stability in the world, security, and we've not done that very well. And I'm about incoming new administration, the Trump administration, in what Mr. Trump has said during the campaign, what he will do and what he won't do, and especially not prioritizing relationships. I mean, he talked about NATO, and he still does. But trade agreements, they're important. They're not perfect. They've got issues. They've got problems. Everything does. But you've got to work with the issues. You've got to work with the problems. Find solutions, not help, but find solutions for everybody.
Well, you know, it's interesting. You mentioned that we've done more for countries than any country ever has. And I mean, the results show, right? I mean, people are lining up to come into America. You don't see that many lines outside China trying to get, but it does get a little bit worrisome. You look at this port in Peru, right? It's a deep water port, accommodates these gigantic container ships, which have 26,000 or so containers, and all the cranes, they don't have any operators on them. They're run by computer. And the vehicles that service the port are all electrically driven. So it's a little bit like we're falling behind in certain very powerful areas, isn't it, Chuck, where we don't have this stuff to offer anymore.
Well, yes, I mean, overall, but there are specific reasons to that too. One reason is that the Chinese have made tremendous progress with their economy, with their technology, what they want to do. They're very focused. They're not a country that embraces freedom. That's secondary, and ultimately, I think that always, and I think history has shown this, will be a huge problem. But for right now, where we are in the world, back to us, we've just not put the kind of focus into this that I think we need to. One reason, I think, is that we've really not grasped everything that's going on in the world. For example, we've generation after generation of Americans since World War II has grown up in a world where the United States is the unrivaled number one power in the world. Nobody close to us.
Absolutely.
And so we kind of just accepted that. Well, that's the way it always was, wasn't it? And that's the way it's always going to be. Well,
yes.
No, not really. Just a cursory reading of history shows that pretty clearly. But so much is going on that I think we haven't paid attention to, and meaning in particularly, where each generation of Americans, where they've come from, how they've grown up, and what they've known of the world doesn't necessarily mean it's going to last. And it means you've got to pay attention and stay ahead of the curve all the time with world affairs. The world has gotten more technology driven. We have more competitors than we've ever had in the world. When we started out in building a world order that we put together after World War II with our friends, that's good news. We wanted everybody to do better, and we wanted to do better. Hopefully, meaning that would be a more peaceful world. So a lot has happened here that I don't think we've paid attention to, and our leaders haven't paid enough attention to it. And I think that's, in my opinion, the primary reason that we're floundering a bit today on some of these issues.
So let me take a moment to remind our viewers that Polaris Live is entirely viewer supported. We'd appreciate your signing up to our mailing list at kashmeri.com and to our YouTube channel, www.polaris-live.com. There's no cost, and it really does help us. Now, your signing up will also give you early notice of our new report, now being prepared for publication in mid-December. It's titled, some say cheekily, Make U.S.-China Relations Great Again. I want to ask you, in the West, the war between Russia and Ukraine, Chuck, this is described as a battle between democracy and authoritarianism. And again, a blue sky question to you, but you're really, I think, more qualified than most to answer it. If it is the big battle between democracy and authoritarianism, why are the largest democracies in the world, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, not supporting the US sanctions against Russia? Your thoughts?
Well, I can't speak for those countries that you listed and others. But I would offer my thoughts this way. I suspect that where these countries are on this particular issue is you start with the fact that India, these other countries have been essentially foreign policy neutral since World War II. No, they veered closer to the Russians and the Soviets in many ways. The Soviets and the Russians, for example, have been their primary supplier of arms. But we're the United States also now participating in that to some extent. Anyway, point being that these countries have been third world countries, have been many of them neutral. I think they don't want to endanger their own situations by taking positions on this or getting involved in this, even though India is a democracy. Russia is no democracy. I think the world understands that. I mean, they have elections, but you know what goes on there. But I don't think they also appreciate this. And I think some in our country, the United States, do not appreciate what I'm about to say. This struggle that Ukraine has been engaged in now for 3 years is a struggle that's just not about Ukraine. I mean, when you look at what's happened here, you are seeing for the first time since World War II, a European independent nation invaded by another nation. Not happened since World War II. A lot of people thought, oh, that'll never happen again. Well, it has. And how this turns out is going to have dramatic consequences for the rest of the world. Mr. Xi and China are watching how the United States in the West respond to this, with their other eye on Taiwan. Other powers are keeping a very clear eye on this as well, because this will send a message, how this turns out, to the world, one way or the other. The West won't defend democracy. It won't defend liberalism, freedom, if we abandon Ukraine. That'll be one very clear message. And from that message, people will take actions based on what they learned from this. On the other hand, if we continue to support Ukraine, and this turns out as well as can be expected for Ukraine, and we, the West, stand with Ukraine, that's another message that it sends to the rest of the world, including China. So a lot at risk here, a lot at stake here. And to your question, why aren't these countries like India and Brazil and others saying things, or at least standing up for freedom, and that all that freedom portends? I think, as I've already said, I think partly it's their own history of third worldism, their neutrality, their concerns for their own interest, and also I don't think they understand what's at stake here for the future of the world.
Well, thank you for that answer. And obviously, as China has gotten stronger, America and China and these people are starting to watch, and as you said earlier, hedge. And it's a terribly complicated scenario, and hopefully we will tend to focus on it, as you underlined, much more than we have. But let me ask you, Mr. Secretary, Polaris-Live is driven by its belief that the relationship between the U.S. and China is consequential, not just for both of us, but for all the other countries in the world. Yet here we are at daggers drawn. Nothing seems to be changing that. So I'd like to ask you, if you had a chance to speak privately and individually with President Xi Jinping and President-elect Donald Trump separately, what advice would you give them for some specific ways to reduce the tension between our two great countries?
Well, Cash, like I had said earlier here in your program, number one, for both leaders, for both countries, understand the dramatic consequences for the world as a result of how the relationship between these two countries, China and the United States, turns out. How this relationship will impact, already is impacting the world, economically, security, militarily, relationships, trade, every way. Understand, first of all of that. Then second, manage these great issues and challenges and differences. Find areas where we can agree for the benefit of both countries as well as the world. Where we disagree, where we have issues, then we need to find mechanisms to address those in a smart way for both countries and a peaceful way. There will be differences. There always are differences. That's the history of man. But it's how you manage those differences that make the difference. between prosperity and war and other possibilities that will come. I mean, those consequences will come if you don't manage them, if you're not handling it right. Also, all of the other countries of the world work off in some way the relationships between the United States and China, and are affected by our relationship, and will move toward one of those two countries. And you don't want a world that's divided up between two superpowers of the world. That makes a very dangerous world, and it makes a less prosperous world, because then you are forced to only do business with or trade with the countries that are closest to you, and you want to, in any way you can, they won't say this, but harm the other countries, rather than taking an approach to the world where freedom of navigation produces freedom of trade, ideas, freedom generally, understanding, a more secure world, a safer world. So those are some things I would mention to the two leaders.
Well, those are wise words indeed. One of the people we talked to said that, maybe we ought to find a project that both can work together for the benefit of all, and neither side will get any advantage over the other. And they recommended something that I'd never heard before, which is tuberculosis, is a disease that China and America have put in the rearview mirror. But it affects about 100 million people a year. And they said, well, the UN has calculated that, for $6 billion or so, we can eradicate it from the world. Well, maybe here's something we can work together again. Do you think projects like this, which will be friction-free, would be helpful to think about?
Oh, absolutely. Define for the good of man, the good of everyone in the world. Find projects like that where we can work together and take the approach that we're not enemies, we're competitors. I mean, if you take that approach toward things, toward everything, find those kind of projects that you're talking about. Space was one of the things that years and years ago was supposed to bring this all together. The Russians, and we still have Russian cosmonauts, American cosmonauts together up in space in other countries. The Chinese are involved. And so exploration of the Arctic was another one. But we've allowed so many of those to get political and seep into, well, there are enemies. We haven't fully accepted that in space yet, in some of these other areas, but those are the kind of things that help bring nations together, help bring the world together. Last point I'd make here, we face a grave danger here in essentially nullifying so many of our important institutions that we created after World War II. And one of them is the United Nations. The United Nations is imperfect. It can't do everything. But think of this. If we would not have had a United Nations since World War II, do you think the world would be better off or worse off? Well, in my opinion, I would say the world would be far worse off, because the United Nations does so much good in so many areas for so many people. And we're nullifying the importance of these kinds of institutions. Trade agreements, another one. And we don't want to do that, because that will force us back to a time that we saw in the 1920s after World War I, 1930s, and then that produced a world war, a second world war. And we've got to be smarter in this. And that's why I say be smart in how you manage all of this. And your relationships are a huge part of it.
Well, I'm so happy we are ending this. We are running out of time on the United Nations, Chuck, that I know you've been such a great supporter. And, I'm reminded that people tend to think about the UN only in terms of war, but they forget the UN Children's Fund, and they forget the World Health Organization, and they forget the Aviation Organization. I mean, the reason all the tickets around the world look alike is because the United Nations set up an organization to put it all together. Well, Secretary Hagel, we have a last run out of time. Your strategic vision is badly needed. We are so happy that you come visit Polaris Live. And so thank you very much for this instructive conversation. And I hope you'll come back again and see us.
I will, Cash. Thank you for doing this and continue to do it. And happy Thanksgiving.
And happy Thanksgiving to you too. And I want to thank our viewers from around the world. Please join us again as we continue to explore the most consequential relationship of our time, that between the United States and China and its impact in the world. Until then, goodbye.